For the first time in nearly a decade, a Canadian Prime Minister is heading to Beijing. Prime Minister Mark Carney departs for China this week to discuss trade and international security at a moment when Canada's relationship with the United States has become, can we just unstable, unpredictable, maybe even openly hostile. This visit isn't symbolic, it's not a routine, and it's definitely not happening in a vacuum. It's happening while the US threatens tariffs, economic retaliation, and even casually flirts with annexation rhetoric, which is horrible. So today, we're going to unpack why Canada is going to China now, what Carney is specifically negotiating, what Canada hopes to gain, what it risks, and why Washington is watching this trip very closely. They are. This is North of MAGA. I'm your host, Pierre Shields. Let's take a look. Why this visit matters now. This is the first visit by Canadian prime ministers to China since 2017. Canada-China relations collapsed after 2018 when Canada arrested a senior executive from Huawei at the request of the United States, triggering retaliation, trade freezes, and years of diplomatic paralysis. That rupture happened under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It never fully healed. What's changed is the strategic environment. Canada now faces serious uncertainty with the United States, driven by war threats and rhetoric from President Donald Trump that goes well beyond normal alliance frictions. So Ottawa is sending a signal. Canada will not allow itself to be economically cornered. The door reopened in 2024. Last October, Carney met Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea. There was no breakthrough, no big announcements, but the tone shifted. That meeting reopened communication channels that had been frozen since 2018. This visit from January 14th to 17th goes further. Senior Canadian officials confirmed Carney is expected to sign multiple memoranda of understanding, MOUs, with more deals still under discussion. China doesn't invite foreign leaders for window dressing. When a prime minister is welcomed in Beijing, especially at the Great Hall of the People, it's because Beijing believes something concrete is possible. What Carney is actually going to negotiate. So what is Mark Carney actually going to negotiate? Well, first, energy access. Canada exports roughly 90% of its oil to the United States. That's not really diversification, it's more of a dependency. With US demands uncertain and Venezuelan supply returning to the market, Canada needs alternative buyers. China is the obvious candidate. Carney is expected to explore expanded Canadian crude exports to China, potentially through long-term supply commitments tied to future infrastructure capacity. This isn't about replacing the US, it's about reducing single buyer vulnerability. Second, canola and agricultural access. China was once Canada's largest export market for canola. That market has been almost completely wiped out by Chinese anti-dumping duties imposed last summer. No one expects those tariffs to vanish overnight, but Canadian officials are clearly seeking partial relief, quota access, or a roadmap towards normalization. For prairie farmers, even incremental movements matter. Third, tariff trade-offs. So Canada's tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles are on the table, not necessarily to be scrapped, but reframed. Those tariffs were introduced during alignment with US policy under the Biden administration. That alignment now delivers far less value. Ottawa's message is simple. If alignment with Washington no longer guarantees economic security, then rigid alignment becomes optional. Fourth, Memorandum of Understanding, or MOUs. Carney is expected to sign MOUs covering trade facilitation, supply chain cooperation, regulatory dialogue, and possibly critical mineral frameworks. They're not binding treaties, but they reopen doors that have been shut since 2018. Finally, and this is the key, strategic signaling. Carney is negotiating room to maneuver, not an alliance, not appeasement, but options. Provinces are split. Not everyone in Canada agrees on how far this reset should go. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has warned Carney not to back down on EV tariffs unless China commits to manufacturing investment in Ontario. And we understand why it's such a big part of their economy. Western farmers are more pragmatic. They don't expect miracles, they expect movement. Because for them, this isn't ideological, it's survival. Security and human rights red lines. This trip carries real risks. Experts warn that deeper cooperation with China, especially in AI, critical minerals, and advanced technology, could expose Canada to national security vulnerabilities. Canada has also raised serious human rights concerns. political imprisonments, the execution of 4 Canadians last year, and allegations of Chinese interference in Canadian elections. Advocacy groups fear Ottawa could trade principles for access. Carney will need to manage that tension carefully because credibility cuts both ways. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much Carney has influence over security. I think we got to start upping our game where that's concerned. The geopolitical message to Washington. This visit has been closely watched in Washington. China understands that. Canada understands that. Beijing may frame this as a contrast. An unpredictable, coercive United States versus a partner offering stability and alternatives. China doesn't need Canada to choose sides. It only needs Canada to hedge. And that alone changes the balance. Conclusion, what this means for Canada. This trip does not mean Canada is pivoting to China. It means Canada is relearning an old lesson. Over-reliance on any single partner, even an ally, is a strategic vulnerability. Carney is signaling that Canada intends to protect its economic and diplomatic freedom of action, even if that makes Washington uncomfortable. The real test is whether Canada can rebalance without compromising its security, sovereignty, or values. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to North of MAGA for clear Canadian analysis that cuts through the spin. Like and share if you believe Canada needs options, not ultimatums. And if you want to support the channel directly, check out the North of MAGA merch store and consider using Super Thanks to buy me a coffee. I like my coffee. It genuinely helps keep this work independent. Thanks for spending time with me. This has been Pierre Shields from North of MAGA. Go play outside.